When Barfield discovered that words have a life, he realized too then that if words change meaning over time, which they do, then they're like what he called fossils of consciousness. They are, if you can recover the older meaning of words, then you can recover different ways that human beings experience life in the past. The word for breath in ancient Greek and Hebrew, and I believe in Sanskrit and other languages too, pneuma in Greek, it didn't just mean breath. It meant also at once wind and also at once spirit. So there wasn't a clearly differentiated sense of spirit that wasn't wind, that wasn't breath. When, for example, Plato discusses breathing, you're not quite sure, is he talking about breath? Is he talking about wind? Is he talking about spirit? And then you realize he's talking about all three things at once. And what's happened, though, Barfield realized, is that with the separation of wind, breath, and spirit, that's because of a kind of uncoupling of human consciousness from the wider world. So hence this notion of the evolution of consciousness. But what I love about Barfield is that these uncouplings, all these alienations, for him, they always themselves have meaning. There's never not meaning. And what that does is it throws the felt sense of separation in the individual onto themselves, so that there's a kind of interior development of consciousness that goes on. And then, much like the pulse of breathing, actually, that can be, as it were, breathed back out into the world. And a new kind of consciousness starts to emerge. And Barfield felt that we're very much in that process of recovery now. The notion of the imagination itself is part of this recovery. Steiner points out that a medieval person never had a problem with the idea that their thoughts weren't really their own thoughts, that they might be given by God or a spirit, a place. They might be given by a demon or another more malign presence or thought. And so you get this great preoccupation in the pre-modern world with the rites and the rituals and the processes of discernment that enable you to understand your thoughts, and particularly the source of your thoughts. Whereas now, of course, very few people would think of their thoughts like that. We're very inclined to think of our thoughts all as our own. And so the question is how we reconnect to this more porous experience of life. And this is where the imagination comes in.
So a big welcome to the second of these dialogues on how do we evolve human consciousness for humanity to be future fit to live on this planet we share with the rest of the extraordinary ecology that we are blessed with. And today I am delighted to welcome Mark Vernon, a writer, a person who opens us to not only Owen Barfield, who we'll touch on, but also to the great poets, Blake, and particularly in his new book, Awake, and also to Dante, and his beautiful exposition of the journey of Dante through the Inferno, Purgatoria, on to Paradiso, which is beautiful. If you've never read Dante, I suggest you start with Mark's elucidation of it. And today we're going to be talking about the role of imagination in evolving human consciousness, and hopefully touching on Dante, Blake, Coleridge, and Owen Barfield, often neglected great thinker of the 20th century. But let me begin with 4 lines that I think are close to Mark's heart and my heart from William Blake. To see the world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. And Mark, today we have probably just under an hour to embrace eternity. But can we just perhaps start with just sharing that we both have a love of the poets, and the poets is opening us to new worlds. We both have a background in psychotherapy, and we've both been lifelong spiritual seekers. But it'd be great for the audience just to hear a bit about what's been your journey that's got you to where you are now, and what's been seminal in opening the doors of eternity for you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and good to launch with Blake's poetry, because the poetry as itself is an invocation. You kind of feel what is being talked about, even in the way it's talked about, which of course is one of the great values of poetry. And maybe for me, coming relatively late perhaps to the way that poetry lives is certainly part of my journey. And I began in my adult life, sort of academically anyway, doing physics, and then I did a philosophy PhD on Plato. And I got to that point where I knew I was drawn to these big questions that, in its different ways, physics, theology, and philosophy deal with, but it always felt slightly distant. Like the rational mind, to kind of make the obvious point, can describe and try and outline, but it can't really engage, or you've already used the word, participate in these things. And you mentioned psychotherapy. I went into my own therapy and then trained. And that really was the beginning of a much more immediate engagement with the dynamism, of one's own inner life, but that little bit more, the inner life of the world around us as well. And Barfield came in because he makes this point that the modern mind, as he puts it, can read the whole of Plato and even write books about Plato and yet not have understood a single word, because of this separation that so dominates the modern mindset. Separation between oneself and others, or oneself and the world. The perception that you don't see a world in a grain of sand or a heaven in a wildflower. You just see a grain of sand and you just see a wildflower. And there's certainly no guarantee of connection with the interiority of other things. But that began to change, and the imagination being seen as a portal through which one can step, rather than my private fantasy, your private fantasy, which, if we're lucky, on occasion finds some sort of shared space, which is more or less the modern version of the imagination. So the sense that the artist might have it very greatly and write words like "to see a world in a grain of sand," but usual mortals, normal mortals, perhaps don't have it so much. No, the imagination has us. And that's why we dream. It's why we speak. It's why we see anything at all. It's why there's a sense of vitality and aliveness, even on a kind of dark day. And yeah, so through therapy, then engaging with these great figures like Barfield and Dante and Blake particularly, they've been very seminal to my spiritual journey, which is broadly in the Christian tradition, but Christian mysticism in particular, and partly actually recovery of the practices that always were there, but have got lost again in the West, aided by the recovery of particularly traditions from the Indian subcontinent. But yeah, a gradual sense that it's possible the doors of eternity might open once more.
And I think this is also a link to the last one I did in this series of dialogues with Rupert Sheldrake, who I know you've done a lot of dialogues with. And in his work, he was saying a lot about how we have to go away from religion being a series of beliefs to it being a series of active practices and spiritual practice. So can you say just a little bit about that shift from religion being a series of thoughts to it being an active participation?
Yeah, the what you're thinking kind of religion kicked in with the Reformation. It's actually quite a dramatic change in the 1520s and the 1530s. Suddenly, certainly within a generation and almost overnight, it became absolutely crucial to identify what you believed. And that seems very strange to us now, because the automatic assumption now is that religion's always been about belief. But it really wasn't. I don't suppose many Christians at all before the 16th century ever uttered the words "I believe," because credo was muttered by the priests in the sanctuary somewhere, but not by most folk who would have been making offerings at the local well or at the local shrine, or praying to the saint, or walking the labyrinth or the pilgrimage. And that was very much how people lived. And there was a worldview, and people did, of course, articulate that worldview and use reason to explore that worldview. But reason then was always a mode of participation. And whereas now it's become this kind of sovereign tool that we assume, at least if you've done any philosophy, maybe not everyone assumes this, but philosophers would assume is the method par excellence to engage with things. But it has this abstracting effect. And so the recovery now, I think, of things like pilgrimage, which Rupert has been one of the people spearheading and championing, and they're very transformative. In a way, we become so uncoupled that even to do something relatively simple, like an intentional walk to a holy place, a cathedral or a well, it almost invariably profoundly moves people. And the reason is because the recovery is there to be made. It's still imminent around us. And similarly with lines like Blake, people find them very powerful because it's all still there. It's just we've been looking in the wrong direction for quite a long time now.
So let's kind of link this back to the whole notion that I don't know why it came into my head, but I think what we're talking about is spirituality is a participative sport. It's not an audience sport. It's not something you do just with your head. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And back to what you said earlier about the connecting from the interior and the exterior, the interior subjective world and the external world that is all around us. There's a quote here from Barfield. Now, my normal everyday experience as human being or the world around me depends entirely on what I bring to the sense datum within. And the absorption of this metaphor into my imagination has enabled me to bring more than I could before. That the whole notion of how we engage with the world either leads us as an isolated individual or as somebody who is, through the imagination in the perception, is part of the world. And I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that and how Barfield articulates that further.
Maybe a little bit of Barfield's biography is helpful, because he does write on occasion about how he discovered the power of poetry, which was when he became very depressed to the point of suicidality in his earlier life. And this was, around the time of the First World War. He saw the mechanization of life, not just worrying in the way that we're often inclined to worry about it now, but literally the mechanized slaughter of millions of people across Europe. Very, very brutal. I mean, we're getting echoes of that, of course, again in Ukraine. But
and in Gaza and Iran
yeah,
and
yeah.
Lebanon, yes.
So that seriously distressed him, and it was through reading poetry, particularly Wordsworth at first, that he realized there was another dynamic that had never gone anyway, but could be released by the power of poetic words. And the move that Barfield made that really helped him was he always learnt or knew to pay attention to the energy in the words of a poem as much as their meaning, not let, as it were, the deciphering of a poem eclipse the sheer spirit of it. And he said it was like looking over a clouded landscape and seeing the sunlight breaking through and falling on a field that then lit up. And this paying attention to the energetics is a bit like them walking towards the field. And that completely transformed him. It completely changed his life. And then he said he noticed this other thing, which was it wasn't just that poetry gave him a lift, but that the world started to appear differently to him as a result. And this is this mode of participation that his imagination was awoken, and that was good in one level, but it then connected with the imagination as forming all things. The tree in its manifestation, the bird in its flight, the wind in its movement. These are all parts of the divine imagination, as much as the movements of our mind are. And so that recognition, and so sense of connection, and then being able to join that, and join it actively to contribute to it. This was all part of Barfield's early discovery. And he then became very interested in things like words. How is it that words have a soul? Words just aren't grunts or signs that we use to point and share information. They are conveyors of meaning. And we enter a shared space when we speak, and we look for the right words. The words come to us as much as we find them. And so this whole philosophy of the dynamic of the imagination and of language and of poetry, and then how that connects to the mystical traditions, particularly in Christianity, really took off for him, and then became his life's work. This all kind of happened in his early 20s, and then he lived to a ripe old age. He was born when Queen Victoria was on the throne, and he died when Tony Blair had become prime minister. These works that he left, and his influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien particularly, are his legacy to us.
And even poets like T.S. Eliot, another great, if you like, mystic poet of the 20th century. But it's very interesting, this that the whole notion that the poetry is not just in the words, it's in the harmonics. The great music is not in the separate notes. It's in the harmonics that connect it. And I think you on several occasions have said, really, to read the great poets like Blake and Dante, we have to do it out loud. It has to be carried on the breath, not just absorbed through what Ian McGilchrist would say, the left hemisphere neocortex.
Yeah, it certainly can be very helpful, especially with more difficult poets like Dante and like Blake, to read them out or listen to an audiobook, because then you do get that multi-dimensional experience. Just to reflect on this way that these things strike us at different levels. If you take a word like light, and light can, of course, refer to the visible light around us, originating with the light of the sun and illuminating objects and the physical world around us. But of course, we use the same word light for an interior experience of being enlightened or having a light bulb moment, or we will say, I see what you mean. which is an interior experience of light. And it's no coincidence that it's the same word that's used, because perceiving is at once an imaginative interior experience as well as an external physical experience. And the two combine. It's why everybody has imagination. If you didn't have imagination, you wouldn't see anything. And that kind of blindness wouldn't be anything to do with your eyes. It's just really impossible, actually. There's no one who doesn't have imagination. But then there's a third kind of light as well, which is, in the mystical traditions, it would be called the dark light, or the invisible light. And this is the source of both the interior light and the manifest external light, which would be called God in theistic traditions. And so you can take these sort of steps, as it were, into the experience. First of all, there's the world around, but then you realize that it lightens you inside. And then there's the perception, as it were, just over the horizon of awareness of the divine source, that this ineffable light, that figures like Blake and like Dante welcome us into.
And so perhaps we could go from there to ask you to say a little bit about Barfield's whole notion about the evolution of consciousness, from original participation through to separation, through to final participation. His great figure you, very Steiner influence, but perhaps you could say a little bit about that, and then we can bring that on to how does this all speak to our current meta crisis, not just the climate crisis, but the great challenges of our time. And how does that help us think about how we have to evolve our ways of thinking to address these challenges? But first of all, can you say a little bit about Barfield and his journey of human journey?
Yeah. So when Barfield discovered that words have a life, he realized too then that if words change meaning over time, which they do, then they're like what he called fossils of consciousness. They are, if you can recover the older meaning of words, then you can recover different ways that human beings experience life in the past. I mean, you mentioned the speaking out loud and the breath and so on just now. And that was the word for breath in ancient Greek and Hebrew, and I believe in Sanskrit and other languages too, pneuma in Greek. It didn't just mean breath. It meant also at once wind and also at once spirit. So there wasn't a clearly differentiated sense of spirit that wasn't wind, that wasn't breath in, say, the mouth of Plato, when he uses the word pneuma. And when, for example, Plato discusses breathing, as he does in his dialogue with Timaeus, it's clear that, well, as you read it, you're not quite sure, is he talking about breath? Is he talking about wind? Is he talking about spirit? And then you realize he's talking about all three things at once.
Yeah.
And so he describes how the spirit becomes the wind, becomes the breath, becomes the wind, becomes the spirit, which is the process of breathing. What happens, though, Barfield realized, is that with the separation of wind, breath, and spirit, that's because of a kind of uncoupling of human consciousness from the wider world. So hence this notion of the evolution of consciousness. But what I love about Barfield is that these uncouplings, all these alienations, for him, they always themselves have meaning. There's never not meaning. And what that does is it throws the felt sense of separation in the individual onto themselves, so that there's a kind of interior development of consciousness that goes on. And then, much like the pulse of breathing, actually, that can be, as it were, breathed back out into the world. And a new kind of consciousness starts to emerge. And Barfield felt that we're very much in that process of recovery now. Steiner, you mentioned Rudolf Steiner, and Barfield discovered these things through his study of words, and then started reading Steiner and realized that Steiner was onto exactly the same thing. And the notion of the imagination itself is part of this recovery. Steiner noticed that the imagination, in a funny sort of way, is not much talked about in the pre-modern world. Shakespeare would be one of the figures in English who really starts to talk about imagination. Whereas in the pre-modern world, the medieval world, and the ancient world, probably the more natural word to use would be inspiration. And again, you got the inspiring there, the breathing into, and
the taking in.
And it's also it's even sort of more participative than that in a way, because Steiner points out that a medieval person never had a problem with the idea that their thoughts weren't really their own thoughts, that they might be given by God or a spirit, a place. They might be given by a demon or another more malign presence or thought. And so you get this great preoccupation in the pre-modern world with the rites and the rituals and the processes of discernment that enable you to understand your thoughts, and particularly the source of your thoughts. Whereas now, of course, very few people would think of their thoughts like that. We're very inclined to think of our thoughts all as our own. And so the question is how we reconnect to this more porous experience of life. And this is where the imagination comes in. And Barfield and Steiner felt that this is why the imagination is so important to the modern mind, because the imagination, as it were, we can't not know that we have fantasies about the way things are. They sort of spring from within us, and therefore, they've sprung from within our own psyches. But we also then can link that to a sense of connection with the world around us. And so, in a way, what our experience now is not being part of a great flow of thought and experience quite spontaneously, but is offering through the imagination our thoughts and experiences and so on back to the world, having them met by the imagination that's also operative in the world, and then reestablishing a participation or a contact. And that's why poetry is so important now, because poetry enables that field of meeting once more. But the sense, of this juncture and reconnection is important because, for example, it places much greater stress on the individual. And so, many of the shifts that have occurred in the modern period are to do with valuing the individual in a way that wouldn't have happened before. There's great advantages there, even as there's the disadvantages. But to your sort of latter point about crises, that both certainly Blake, and I think Barfield and Steiner too, felt that whatever the manifest crises we feel that we're in the midst of, the ground has been prepared for those crises through this uncoupling, this process of uncoupling. And so the way that the modern imagination has fantasized about disconnection, or fantasized about the power of the machine over the human psyche, a dream that goes all the way back to Francis Bacon and before, that is the spiritual underpinning of what we're facing manifestly now. And so whilst you need to do some of the firefighting and maybe some of the ethical work to try and contain and control things, the real work comes in with a spiritual revival again, which would be to know that we're connected to all these things, that we're part and parcel of this wider ecology again. And then our desire, our yearning, our wants will become more aligned with what's good for all things, because we'll know that our good and the good of all things is intimately connected. So they would say, sure, have the great discussions about climate change, sure, have the great discussions about AI, and no doubt there's legal frameworks and all sorts of things that need to be put in place for that. But do the spiritual work of reconnection, and then, as it were, to use the YouTube image, the turnabout can come, and the restoration, but with difference, might begin.
And perhaps I can link this to one of my first great teachers, and I was lucky enough to hear him live before he died, is Gregory Bateson. Just take it slightly beyond the kind of the religious context. And he was one of the first in the 1970s to be saying that the climate crisis, which he was writing about in the 60s and 70s, very early on, him and Rachel Carlson were two of the first, is actually an epistemological crisis. And he writes at length about, we've misunderstood Darwin. The unit of survival, and therefore the unit of flourishing, is never the individual or the family or the team, the organization, the country, the species. It's always any one of those in co-creation with the other systemic levels they are part of. Yeah? So the species that destroys its ecological niche destroys itself. Right? And I think at one point he says that any people who relegate God just to a transcendent force beyond will end up, do not have a snowball in hell's chance, I think was his phrase, of surviving the next 100 years, because we'll destroy the world by our own greed, our own self-centered ambition. And I think that sense of how do we heal that split between the human and more than human world is at the center of all these kind of great writers. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, good to go back to the Blake quote, to see a world with a grain of sand and a heaven and a wildflower. It's to become much clearer about our vocation with what it is to live in the world of which we're part.
Our calling, yes, that sense of what are we being called to do rather than what we want to do.
Yeah.
That difference. I'm just interested in that, right?
Yeah, or ideally the alignment of the calling and the wanting, because then the whole of the energy of the human spirit is aligned and coherent with the whole.
Yes.
I mean, it's one thing to say that it's generations long to bring about the change. It's very remarkable, for instance, that when you look back, I don't know if you look back to the time of Dante, in the 13th, 14th centuries, this was the beginning of the period when the economy was being realigned towards one for mercantilism, for extraction. Dante uses the image of the windmill to describe his first sight of Lucifer on the frozen floor of hell. And windmills were very unsettling bits of machinery for Dante's period. They come into Europe through the Islamic Empire and were beginning to be seen all over the hillsides. Dante's father was a merchant, probably a cloth merchant, and so the way that windmills were empowering that new money, that new sense of the economy, was just beginning to really get going. But the point about windmills, to go back to our remarks about Numa, is that windmills extracted the power of the wind and, as it were, discarded the presence of spirit and breath. And so they were seen as diabolical, even as they were empowering. And so Dante is born almost in the generation where this is really starting to shift the economy until, you've got other moments, notably the discovery of coal and so on, which, provides the raw energy that even the windmill can't. But nonetheless, um, that rejigging of the whole of human life, to your point about the systemic shifts, it happens over hundreds of years. And I think that it's always got to be led by the reconstruction of human desire, I think. Otherwise you can't really engage the full faculties. To use Ian McGilchrist's phrase, it's going to be the left brain struggling to do what really it takes the whole of consciousness to live into. So the analyses, I think, are useful and they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. And I think this is why the poetry and the spirituality matters too. That is about stirring. Well, maybe human desires don't need to be stirred. Human desire, human imagination never went anywhere. We clearly live in a wildly imaginative time. There's barely a surface that you look at now in the modern world that isn't laden with an image or words, that's designed to draw our desires through some kind of imaginative representation. But the trouble with all that desire and imagination that so powerfully shapes modern consumerism is that it's incoherent. It doesn't know really what it's for. It delivers, as it were, momentary delights, or momentary stimulation, but has no center. It doesn't come from anywhere apart from, the myriad scattered minds that are making it. So it's not that we lack imagination or we lack desire, but it needs educating, really. And Blake made this point. Blake says, more is the cry of a mistaken soul. This kind of hedonic treadmill, I must have more, I must have more. But he doesn't say, therefore, cut out what you want. He says, no, less than all cannot satisfy man. We need to recover the true goal of our desire, which, the shorthand in theistic circles would be the divine presence, that's immanent and transcendent.
So let's explore this a bit further. But first, let me say, one of the things I really appreciated about reading your book on Dante's Divine Comedy was how you show in that descent of Dante into the Inferno, and you've mentioned his own struggles being brought up in Florence, and how very much in Florence was the beginnings of the mercantile competition, capitalism, avarice, civil war. And we meet all of that in the people he meets in hell. Yes, I'm always struck. I grew up before decimal currency, and we had a florin, which of course comes from Florence. The beginning of money started very much in Florence, and his exploration of that. But your line, the reconstruction of human desire, and you've gone on to Blake. Let's look at what does that actually mean? How do we reconstruct human desire? I've written quite a bit about how do we face the meta crisis, and you've written, I think, 2021, you read a paper that's still available on your website about the ecological crisis and being a spiritual crisis. Yes, I think that's right. How do we reconstruct human desire? Let's try and explore that together.
I mean, it's a bit of a neat move on my part, but I don't think you can reconstruct it. But I think you can understand it better. I mean, one of Blake's phrases from the Auguries of Innocence is, oh no, maybe it's a proverb of hell actually. And one of his short pithy sayings is, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." And I think what he means there is that desire, in a way, is always wanting what's good. It just gets very mistaken. And so understanding the mistakes it makes is really the important thing. And then it self-corrects. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. And I think that works at many different levels. It works, I mean, partly through the processes of psychotherapy, understanding, and I don't just mean one-on-one psychotherapy, but the insights that these traditions can offer individuals, but also groups and wider collectives and so on, which it's not really primarily designed to change, but is designed to illuminate. And then the illumination itself is what leads to the change. But I think then there's also, you might say, an exoteric as well as an esoteric education, which is asking ourselves, what are we feeding ourselves with? This is the sense of disturbance around scrolling all the time. We kind of know it's not much good for us. But rather than, as it were, getting moralizing or too legalistic about it and sort of just banning things, which leaves your desire still floundering around and it just will land on something else, no doubt. I think, keep scrolling, as it were, but keep asking yourself, but what do I really want? What do I really want? You're stirring your desire through the scrolling. You're aware that the scrolling doesn't really satisfy it. So what might you look to instead? And who knows, that might lead you back to reading a poem. It might lead you to going for a walk. It might lead you to doing a sustained course with others. It's all the things that we kind of know. I think there's no rabbit out of the hat here. But this partly is to the point about the U bend as well, that, maybe we're kind of tragic creatures, and it's only when things get really bad that there can be a turnaround and things become better again. And again, it needn't be a terrible tragedy. It's, a moment's reflection reveals just in everyday life, if you focus on what feels narrowing of the soul or expansive of the soul, or and so on. But at times it is breakdowns that are required for breakthroughs to occur.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
I think
some kind of process like that, in addition to analysis and reconstruction and so on. I mean, capitalism, for all that it brings, it is an extraordinary engine for trying to meet human desire. And my hope would be that at an economic level, there would be a kind of enlightened capitalism that would understand what it is that brings about human desire and can meet that there. I mean, in a way, it's the modern equivalent of the medieval cathedral. The medieval cathedral was this extraordinary, socially extensive undertaking to meet human desire by connecting with the divine. It was wildly excessive in terms of pure materialism, but it was that excess put to good use. And so whatever the modern equivalent of the medieval cathedral is, that's what can guide all our activity. The activity doesn't have to stop. It just needs to find a better course.
Yes. I think it's in Blake that the line, there is no, it may be another, but there is no ascent without descent. And I think you're touching on that, either in our human individual journey or collective species journey. That, and if I hear you right, that there's something about your line, what truly satisfies. So there is this search for either money or fame or the age of more. I've written about the age of more bit like your Blake quote, where we become an addicted society. And you mentioned that in terms of many more scrolling on our phones, or more searching for more of this, more of that, more of the other. But what truly satisfies is, I think, what we're getting to, which is what feeds not just the moment, but feeds our deeper self. Yeah, not our momentary self.
Yeah. No, the word addiction is a very useful one. I think I have a psychotherapy colleague, Jason Wright, who's written about Blake and others too, and he has argued that addiction is the psychopathology of the modern age, and the reason for that is not primarily because of a obsession with consuming. It's because we've misunderstood what will satisfy our desire. So an addiction, sometimes it's said, is the wrong answer to the right question. And because it's the wrong answer, as it were, the question keeps getting repeatedly asked, and spirals out of control. And behind that too, I think primarily is a misunderstanding of matter and spirit, that we're turning to the material world to try and satisfy spiritual yearnings. And so you get addictions to mostly material things or material actions, say if it's a sexual addiction. But I think there's a further thing which maybe we need to introduce here now, which is to do with the sense of the self as well. Because what this satisfaction is also about is a discovery of the true location of ourselves, which is not in the isolated individual, yourself and myself. Again, if that is the experience center of our identity, then it too will lead to addictive behavior, because it will be constantly trying to possess and hold to itself what it feels it needs. Whereas when that sense of self can be re-identified and truly identified, again, to use a bit of shorthand, but with the divine self, with the center that is the center of all things. And so for human beings, that leads to this whole area about sacrifice and offering and so on, because then the mode shifts from wanting things for oneself to offering things to the wider self. I don't know, there's a kind of, there are two kinds of power in ancient Greek. And one is the power of grasping and possessing, of utility, you might say. But the other is the power of allure that draws us out of ourselves into the wider world. So as well as this education of our desire, with that comes, I think, an old but made new understanding of really the center of ourselves, which is feels like a decentering, so feels like a death even. This is one of the reasons why breakdown is so powerful when it doesn't destroy you, because it's a necessary precursor to the remaking of you, but which is with a truer sense of yourself in, what Jung would call self with a capital S rather than with a small s, for example, or at least in the English translations. Yeah.
I'm glad you've brought in the word lure. It's very central to A.N. Whitehead as well, that sense that again goes back to the sense of calling. And in my book on beauty and leadership and coaching, I talk about, well, actually it's not in the book, but since then I've written about beauty opens the door, love invites us in. Beauty opens the door, love welcomes us home. And in that is the notion that what is the home? It is to be part of all the systemic levels that we reside within. The family, the community, the sense of place, the ecology, the divine. And to recognize that all those levels that we abide within us. Yes. So I think if we go back to Barfield, in original participation, there we don't have that sense of the separation. Then we go through the descent into the small self. We find we build our ego. We go searching to follow our desires with a small d, perhaps. But then I think it's Bernardo Kastrup more recently who said the only freedom is in service. Unless we are serving all those levels we reside within, we are not serving ourselves. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
No, for sure. Yeah. It's a very limited freedom when you have a very limited sense of yourself. I mean, that would naturally follow. And again, you know that when you're caught up in a pattern of scrolling, there's a kind of freedom. You can keep flicking, new stuff will appear, but it's a very constrained kind of freedom. And of course, you're in the service in a way of the algorithm. But a wider freedom that, people would know. I mean, even when you get lost in the flow of reading someone like Blake or like Dante, you're giving all that you have in that engagement. But the sense of freedom is because you're entering a world that's much bigger than you knew, than yourself. And so that feels liberating. Again, sort of the minute you start thinking about what really brings freedom that feels, ever expansive, it's going to involve giving yourself away. It's going to involve certain, I don't know, the teacher who feels the love of their work. It's a teacher who brings all they have. It's not a denial of themselves. It absolutely requires them to offer their very best to those they're teaching. But the liberation and the joy and the freedom comes when that is seen to thrive in those the person is teaching. And then there's a shared space as well. So this move out, offering of your very best, that part of the trouble with this language of sacrifice and service and so on is that certainly in the West, it becomes a bit masochistic and it becomes a bit moralizing. Like, you ought to. And I don't know, perhaps the most common Christian experience is guilt, therefore. And I think this is part of the reason why Christianity just has stopped appealing to people. But if you can just put to one side the moralizing and instead try and tune into the wisdom, this world that these traditions like Christianity are inviting you into, then maybe there can be some kind of turnaround.
Let me just unpick this a little with you before we finish, which is, I grew up in a very kind of moralizing Protestant Christianity. And that sense of self-sacrifice, which I don't think we fully understood. So, you talked about S, the small s, and self with a big S. And Jung, and indeed many of the great Sufi writers talk about the phases of life, the growing up, the going out in the world, the establishing of one's ego in order to survive, to have a family, to be able to support it and protect it. But then the second half of life that people like Jung, James Hillman, James Hollis talk about, which is then, or in the Sufis called fana, the death of the little self. And that's the descent. That's the descent of Dante. That's the descent of loss in Blake's great work on Jerusalem. But in that, the finding of the fuller self, where sacrifice and service is actually serving all the levels that we're part of, but in so doing, we are serving ourselves. The two are not separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very well put. It's important. Yeah. It's in losing your life that you find it, as Jesus put it in the Christian inflection of this as well. And but that wider path, that you outlined there, that when you're born into the world, the first task, if you like, is to become something in the world, and that's why that kind of education matters too. I mean, you might even look to the story of Jesus and remember that if he lived till about 33, the first 30 years of his life we almost know nothing about, because that was when he was becoming a figure in first century Palestine.
And a decent carpenter.
Yeah, whatever was going on. Yeah, so and then there's a Buddhist teacher, Jack Cornfield, who I've heard say, you've got to become a someone before you can be a no one, because the becoming a no one is the offering of something to that wider sense. So you've got to have something to offer.
Yeah. But it's on this journey. I love this line. Eventually, to get to the place where you're not feeling I have a life, but life right now temporarily has a me. And my way of practically applying that, like now I'm a grandfather. I've also got quite a lot of adopted grandchildren because I love being around children. And I used to say, what do you want to be when you grow up? The very common phrase. I realize what an awful question that is, because young boys will say Lionel Messi or Harry Kane, I suppose, will be current right now. The girls will say, I want to be Taylor Swift. And you're condemning them to disappointment. Because that place is already taken.
Yeah.
So now I'll ask a young child, what do you love doing? What are you passionate about? That's the lure, isn't it? And when they get to 13 or 14, I'll say, where do you make your best contribution to your class or to your family? What was your unique contribution that you do better than anyone else in the family? Because then we're beginning to educate that sense of, I satisfy myself by satisfying the worlds that I reside within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very beautifully put. The world needs a me.
And nobody occupies the space that you occupy. So how can you most fully occupy that space? Because that's your biggest gift.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe there's even something in wanting to become, say, Messi, because there is the brilliance of Messi, and there's this wealth and whatever else that no doubt would is a kind of is a dazzling part of him. But I guess what is also the clear in certainly in a character like Messi is that it's the love of the football, and it's the way that he gives his genius away. That there's something about this extraordinary generosity with him. He does seem like quite a selfless person. At least he's being himself fully for the beauty of the game, you might say. And people would say that he enhanced the game. And so the question of what it is, what can you enhance, what can you offer, which is part of your love and your desire, but also self-recognition too, and then the effort that's required to develop all that.
How could you be the dazzling Mark Vernon? Which I think, that's your gift, isn't it? You have your, the phrase I use when I work with organizations constantly is, what is it that you can uniquely do that the world of tomorrow needs?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And just because I know you have to go and meet one of your psychotherapy clients as part of your, that through that giving, you discover the fullness of your own self.
Yeah, that's right. And just to say, it's a mix. There is the moments of joy, but there's the moments of struggle and confusion and recognition that you need to live a different way, because it's not bringing it's not bringing happiness if you don't, and it's probably bringing a whole load of fear and anxiety if you don't as well. So it comes out of a mess, to put it like that, and experiment and trial and error and so on. But trying to stay alert to what is drawing you and promising, again, to use the Christian phrase, a peace, but it's a peace that passes understanding.
So hopefully you have this line that all inquiry begins with wonder, and perhaps also ends in wonder. So could you help us end with another line from Blake?
Yeah, well, there's another quatrain that you kind of sense the meaning of it. You know perhaps that you want more of it, but it's a lifetime to really inhabit it. And that's Blake's phrase, he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And that's a phrase that I honor in the hope as much as in the knowing.
Yes. Another beautiful, some of my favorite lines. So hopefully in this hour we have at least kissed the joy as it flies. And thank you so much, Mark, for this very enjoyable hour together. And hopefully we've opened a few windows, and not just looked at the windows, but looked through them to the life that is beyond. So thank
you, Peter. It's good talking about these things because it helps foster it in me and us, but also I hope in others too.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.